The morning sun cast long shadows through the stained-glass windows of Mount Olive Baptist Church when Reverend Samuel Washington delivered what would become known as his final sermon. It was August 15, 1971, in the small town of Meridian, Mississippi, where the summer heat pressed down like a heavy blanket and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Samuel's voice, rich and resonant, filled the modest wooden sanctuary as he spoke about courage in the face of darkness, about standing firm when storms threatened to shake the very foundations of faith. His congregation of 43 souls listened with the intensity of people who understood that some words carried more weight than others, that in a place where being black and speaking truth could cost everything, every Sunday service might be the last. Where were you when you first heard stories of people who vanished not because they wanted to disappear, but because someone wanted them gone? Let us know in the comments. These stories deserve to be remembered. Samuel Washington was 34 years old, with calloused hands that spoke of a youth spent in cotton fields before God called him to a different kind of harvest. He had arrived in Meridian 3 years earlier, driving a beat-up Buick loaded with theology books and an unwavering belief that the church should be more than a place of Sunday worship. It should be a beacon of hope and change. His wife, Ruth, 28 and pregnant with their second child, would later tell people that Samuel had been different that morning. Not afraid, she always insisted, but somehow more present, as if he was trying to memorize every face in the congregation, every ray of sunlight filtering through those windows he had helped install with his own hands. The threats had been escalating for months, anonymous phone calls in the dead of night, voices distorted by hatred, telling him to pack up and leave town. Crosses burned in the church parking lot, rocks thrown through the windows of the small house behind the church, where Samuel, Ruth, and their 4-year-old daughter Grace made their home. But Samuel Washington was not a man easily deterred. He had grown up in the Mississippi Delta, where fear was as common as humidity, and he had learned early that running away only meant carrying your fears to a new address. That Sunday morning, as the congregation sang Amazing Grace with voices that seemed to understand the hymn's promise of survival through darkness, Samuel noticed the unfamiliar faces in the back pew. 3 white men in ill-fitting suits, their presence as subtle as a thunderclap in the intimate space of Mount Olive Baptist. They did not sing. They did not bow their heads during prayer. They simply watched, their eyes fixed on Samuel with the kind of attention that made the air in the room feel thinner, more dangerous. After the service, as Samuel shook hands with his parishioners at the church door, Mrs. Ethel Mae Johnson, the church's oldest member at 79, gripped his hand a little longer than usual. Her weathered fingers, lined with the geography of a hard life, trembled slightly as she whispered, "Pastor, maybe it's time for a little vacation. Maybe take Ruth and the baby somewhere nice for a while." Samuel smiled, the kind of gentle, knowing smile that had made him beloved in the community, and patted her hand. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "vacation is what we take after the work is finished, and our work here is far from finished." The 3 strangers had disappeared by the time the last congregant shook Samuel's hand, but their presence lingered like smoke in the Mississippi air. Samuel locked the church doors with deliberate care, checking each window latch as he made his evening rounds. The building, constructed in 1923 by the hands of men who understood that creating sacred space required both faith and stubbornness, stood solid against the gathering dusk. Samuel ran his hands along the worn wooden pews, straightened the hymnals, and adjusted the simple wooden cross that hung behind the pulpit. These were the actions of a man who loved his calling, who saw in every small maintenance task a form of prayer. Ruth was waiting for him on the front porch of their house, her hand resting on her swollen belly, where their second child, due in October, was already making its presence known with restless kicks. The porch light cast a warm circle of yellow against the darkness that seemed to press closer with each passing night. Samuel sat beside her on the wooden swing he had built during their first summer in Meridian, when hope felt as endless as the Mississippi horizon. "Those men in church today," Ruth said quietly, not looking at him but staring out into the darkness beyond their small yard. "I've never seen them before." Samuel nodded, wrapping his arm around his wife's shoulders. "I know. Samuel, Grace asks me every night why people throw rocks at our windows. What am I supposed to tell her?" The question hung in the air like the weight of all the prayers ever spoken in desperation. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, listening to the night sounds of rural Mississippi, crickets chirping, a dog barking in the distance, the gentle creak of their porch swing moving back and forth. These were the sounds of normalcy, of life continuing its ancient rhythms, even when individual lives hung in the balance. "Tell her that sometimes people are afraid of love," Samuel said finally. "Tell her that when people see others trying to make the world a little bit kinder, a little bit more fair, it sometimes scares them because it means they might have to change too. And change is frightening, even when it's change for the better." Ruth leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Neither of them spoke about the phone call that had come that afternoon while Samuel was preparing his sermon. The voice, rough and cold, had delivered a message that was both specific and chilling. Wednesday night, after prayer meeting. Last warning. Ruth had answered the phone, and the words had hit her like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and shaking. She had not told Samuel about the call, just as she had not told him about the 2 similar calls from the week before. Some burdens, she had decided, were too heavy to share, even in a marriage built on honesty and faith. Wednesday was August 18, 1971. 3 days away. Wednesday evening prayer meetings at Mount Olive Baptist had always been smaller, more intimate affairs than Sunday services. Usually 15 to 20 people would gather in the sanctuary's warm lamplight, sharing testimonies, lifting up prayer requests for sick relatives and struggling neighbors, and finding comfort in the kind of community that could only be forged in the crucible of shared hardship and common faith. Samuel Washington treasured these evenings, when the formal structure of Sunday worship gave way to something more conversational, more raw and real. On August 18, 1971, 18 people came to prayer meeting despite the rumors that had been circulating through Meridian's black community like wildfire. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when that word carried the weight of danger. People had heard about the threatening phone calls, seen the burned crosses, noticed the unfamiliar cars that had been driving slowly past the church at odd hours. Yet they came anyway, drawn by loyalty to their pastor and by the stubborn faith that had sustained their ancestors through slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and all the thousand small and large cruelties that comprised daily life in the Deep South. Mrs. Ethel Mae Johnson arrived first, as she always did, carrying her worn leather Bible and a plate of cornbread that she claimed was left over from dinner, but which everyone knew she had made specifically for prayer meeting. She was followed by the Turner family, parents and 3 teenage children who sang in the church choir with voices that could make angels weep. Deacon Robert Hayes, a man who worked double shifts at the lumber mill to support his family, came directly from work, still wearing his sawdust-covered overalls and carrying the scent of pine and honest labor. Samuel greeted each person individually, shaking hands with the men, embracing the women and children, asking about sick relatives and job situations and school preparations. This was pastoral care at its most fundamental level, the recognition that faith was not an abstract concept, but something that had to be lived out in the particulars of daily existence. Samuel had learned this approach from his own pastor growing up, Reverend Moses Clay, who had told him that being a minister meant being willing to carry a piece of everyone's burden, to make their struggles your own. The prayer meeting began at 7:30, as always, with the singing of Precious Lord. The hymn, composed by Thomas Dorsey after his wife died in childbirth, had become an anthem of survival in black churches across the South. As the voices rose together in the small sanctuary, blending in harmonies that seemed to lift the very walls toward heaven, Samuel felt the familiar sensation of being exactly where God intended him to be. Whatever came next, whatever dangers lurked in the Mississippi darkness, this moment was perfect and complete. The testimonies that evening carried an edge of urgency that everyone felt but no one openly acknowledged. Mrs. Johnson spoke about trusting God even when you couldn't see the path ahead. Deacon Hayes shared a verse from Psalm chapter 23 about walking through the valley of the shadow of death and fearing no evil. Young Mary Turner, 16 years old with eyes that held too much knowledge of the world's capacity for cruelty, stood and sang a solo version of We Shall Overcome that left everyone in tears. Ruth Washington sat in the front pew, her 5-month pregnancy beginning to show beneath the simple blue dress she had sewn herself. Grace, now 4 years old and usually restless during church services, sat quietly beside her mother, as if she too sensed that this evening was different from others. Samuel watched his family from the pulpit and felt a complex mixture of love, pride, and fear that nearly overwhelmed him. How do you protect the people you love most when you yourself are the source of the danger that threatens them? At 8:45, Samuel closed the prayer meeting with a benediction that he would later realize was also a farewell, though he did not know it at the time. "May the Lord bless you and keep you," he said, his hands raised over the small congregation. "May his face shine upon you and give you peace." And may you never forget that even in the darkest night, the light of his love continues to burn, waiting to guide you home. The congregants filed out slowly, reluctantly, as if they sensed that something was ending. Mrs. Johnson lingered, pretending to organize her purse while actually watching Samuel's face for signs of, what? Fear? Resolve? Some indication of what he planned to do about the threats that everyone knew about but no one discussed directly. Samuel helped her down the church steps, his hand gentle on her elbow as she navigated the uneven concrete that had been poured during the church's construction 48 years earlier. "Pastor," she said quietly when they reached her car, an ancient Ford that somehow continued running through faith and automotive prayers. "My grandmother used to tell me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding that something else is more important than the fear." Samuel nodded, understanding that this was both blessing and warning, both encouragement and goodbye. "Your grandmother was a wise woman, Mrs. Johnson. She also used to say that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is live to fight another day." Samuel helped her into the car and watched as she drove away, her headlights cutting through the thick Mississippi darkness. One by one, the other members of his congregation departed, until only the Turner family remained. Robert Turner, the father, was a quiet man who worked as a mechanic and had fought in Korea, returning home to a country that had asked for his service abroad while denying him basic dignity at home. "Reverend," Robert said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen enough of the world to understand how it worked. "My family and we're going to visit my sister in Chicago for a few weeks, leaving tomorrow morning. Early." Samuel understood. This was not really about visiting relatives. This was about survival, about removing loved ones from the path of a storm that everyone could see approaching but no one could prevent. "Give your sister my regards," Samuel said, shaking Robert's hand. "Travel safely." After the last car pulled away from the church parking lot, Samuel and Ruth walked home through the humid Mississippi night. The air was thick enough to swim through, heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and the promise of rain. Their house, a modest two-bedroom structure that the church provided for its pastor, sat 50 yards behind the church building, connected by a gravel path that Samuel had lined with marigolds. Ruth had planted their first spring in Meridian. Ruth tucked Grace into bed while Samuel made his final rounds, checking the locks on both the church and their home, drawing the curtains closed against the darkness outside. This had become his nightly ritual, these small acts of protection that felt both necessary and futile. What good were locks against the kind of hatred that burned crosses and threatened families? What good were curtains against the kind of evil that hid behind white sheets and claimed to speak for God? At 11:15, Samuel was sitting at his kitchen table, working on Sunday's sermon by the light of a single lamp, when he heard the cars approaching. 3 vehicles, moving slowly, their engines barely audible above the night sounds of rural Mississippi. Samuel's hand stilled on his pen as he listened to the cars pull into the church parking lot, their doors opening and closing with the soft precision of people who did not want to be heard. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway, her robe pulled tight around her pregnant body, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that no amount of faith could completely dispel. "Samuel," she whispered, "maybe we should call." "Call who?" Samuel asked gently, and Ruth understood. In Meridian, Mississippi, in 1971, the people who were supposed to protect law-abiding citizens were often the same people who threatened them. The sheriff's department, the police, the local government. These institutions were not safe harbors for people who looked like Samuel Washington and dared to speak about justice and equality. A soft knock came at the front door, not urgent, not demanding, but somehow more terrifying for its politeness. Samuel rose from his chair, kissed Ruth's forehead, and whispered, "Take Grace and go to the back bedroom. Lock the door. No matter what you hear, don't come out until morning." The knock came again, patient and inexorable as death itself. Samuel Washington opened the front door of his home at 11:27 p.m. on August 18, 1971, and stepped into history's shadow. 3 men stood on his porch, their faces illuminated by the yellow glow of the porch light he had installed himself just 2 months earlier. They were not wearing white hoods, not carrying torches, not displaying any of the theatrical symbols usually associated with racial terrorism in the Deep South. Instead, they looked almost ordinary, middle-aged white men in work clothes who could have been farmers or shop owners or mechanics, the kind of people Samuel might have nodded to politely if he had encountered them at the hardware store or the post office. But their eyes held a coldness that no amount of ordinary appearance could disguise. These were not men who had come to talk. Reverend Washington, the tallest of the three, said, his voice carrying a soft Mississippi drawl that transformed Samuel's name into something that sounded both respectful and threatening. "We need to have a conversation with you, away from your family, away from your home." Samuel's training as a minister had taught him to look for the humanity in every person, to believe that even the hardest hearts could be reached through compassion and understanding. But as he stood on his front porch, facing three men whose presence felt like a physical manifestation of all the hatred and violence that had plagued his community for generations, Samuel Washington understood that some conversations were not really conversations at all. They were foregone conclusions dressed up in the language of dialogue. "Gentlemen," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the fear that was making his heart beat so hard he was certain the men could hear it. "It's late, and my wife is expecting our second child. Perhaps we could continue this conversation tomorrow, at a more appropriate now." The second man interrupted, shorter than the first, but carrying an air of authority that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This conversation happens now." Samuel glanced back toward the interior of his house, where he knew Ruth was crouched in the back bedroom with Grace, both of them listening to every word, both of them depending on him to make the right choice. But what was the right choice when all the options led to darkness? If he refused to go with the men, would they force their way into his home? Would they hurt his family? If he went with them, would he ever see Ruth and Grace again? The third man, who had remained silent until this moment, stepped closer to Samuel. He was younger than the others, perhaps 30, with the kind of lean build that suggested physical work, and the kind of pale eyes that seemed to reflect light without warmth. "Reverend," he said, and there was something in his voice that was more frightening than outright threats, a casualness, as if what was about to happen was as ordinary as discussing the weather. "You've been preaching about change, about justice, about things that frankly aren't your concern. We're here to help you understand why that needs to stop." Samuel looked at each man in turn, memorizing their faces with the instinct of someone who understood that details might matter later, that bearing witness was sometimes the only form of resistance available. The tall man had a scar on his left cheek, probably from childhood. The shorter man wore a wedding ring and had calloused hands that spoke of manual labor. The younger man kept touching his shirt pocket, as if reassuring himself that something important was still there. "My concern," Samuel said quietly, "is the gospel of Jesus Christ. That gospel calls us to love our neighbors, to care for the poor, to speak truth in the face of injustice. If that threatens you, then perhaps the problem is not with my preaching, but with your understanding of what it means to be a follower of Christ." The words were out before Samuel could stop them, and he immediately regretted not being more diplomatic, more careful. But truthfully, diplomacy felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. If these men had come to hurt him, and their presence suggested that violence was inevitable regardless of what he said, then at least he would face that violence having spoken honestly about his beliefs. The shorter man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made Samuel's blood run cold. "Reverend, I think you've misunderstood something fundamental about your situation here in Meridian. This community has existed in peace and harmony for generations. Folks know their place, they keep to their own kind, and everyone gets along just fine. But lately, there's been some confusion about how things work around here. Some people have been getting ideas above their station. And that kind of confusion can spread if it's not addressed quickly and decisively." Samuel understood. This was not really about his preaching, or even about his activism within the black community. This was about the ancient mathematics of oppression, the careful calculations that kept some people in power by ensuring that others remained powerless. Samuel Washington, by the simple act of believing that he and his community deserved dignity and justice, had disrupted that mathematics. And disruptions, no matter how peaceful or justified, could not be tolerated. "I need to tell my wife," Samuel began. "No," the tall man said firmly. "She'll figure it out." Samuel took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the humid Mississippi air that smelled of honeysuckle and impending rain. This might be the last time he would smell these familiar scents, the last time he would stand on the porch of the home where he had been happier than he had ever thought possible. He thought about Ruth, 6 months pregnant and terrified, listening from the back bedroom. He thought about Grace, 4 years old, and still young enough to believe that her father could protect her from all the monsters in the world. He thought about the congregation of Mount Olive Baptist, good people who had trusted him to lead them in faith, and who would wake up tomorrow to discover that their pastor had vanished in the night. "Reverend," the younger man said, and this time his voice carried something that might have been genuine regret. "This doesn't have to be harder than it needs to be. You can make this easy, or you can make this difficult. But either way, you're coming with us." Samuel Washington stepped off his porch and walked toward the 3 cars parked in the church parking lot. He did not look back at his home, where the porch light continued to burn like a small beacon against the Mississippi darkness. He did not call out goodbye to his wife and daughter. He simply walked forward, his feet crunching on the gravel path between his house and the church, his mind surprisingly calm for a man who understood that he was almost certainly walking to his death. The last thing Samuel saw as he was guided toward the waiting cars was Mount Olive Baptist Church, its white wooden walls ghostly in the moonlight, its simple steeple pointing toward heaven with the stubborn faith of people who had built something beautiful in a place where beauty was often considered dangerous. Samuel had preached in that church for 3 years, had baptized children in the creek behind the building, had married young couples and buried old saints, and tried with every sermon to plant seeds of hope in soil that often seemed too hard and too bitter to sustain new growth. Now someone else would have to tend those seeds. The car doors closed with the soft finality of endings that cannot be undone. The engines started, and the 3 vehicles pulled slowly out of the church parking lot, their headlights sweeping across the marigolds that Ruth had planted along the gravel path. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the vast Mississippi night, carrying Samuel Washington away from everything he loved and toward a fate that would remain hidden for 40 years. In the back bedroom of the pastor's house, Ruth Washington held her 4-year-old daughter and listened to the sound of the cars driving away. She would wait until dawn to call for help, hoping against hope that somehow her husband would return. But deep in her heart, in the place where wives store their darkest fears, Ruth Washington already knew that Samuel was never coming home. The porch light burned until sunrise, a small act of faith in a night filled with darkness. Time moved differently in Meridian, Mississippi after the night Samuel Washington disappeared. For Ruth Washington, now a widow at 28 with a 4-year-old daughter and another child growing in her womb, time became something to be endured rather than lived. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, months into years of questions without answers, of searching faces in crowds for the impossibly familiar, of waking each morning with the fresh wound of remembering that Samuel was gone. The official investigation lasted exactly 11 days. Sheriff William Buck Morrison, a man whose family had held law enforcement positions in the county for 3 generations, conducted what he called a thorough examination of all available evidence. This examination consisted of interviewing 3 members of Mount Olive Baptist congregation, taking a brief statement from Ruth Washington, and filing a report that concluded Reverend Samuel Washington had departed the area voluntarily, possibly to avoid certain unspecified debts and obligations. Ruth Washington knew this was a lie. Samuel had never owed money to anyone. Their life had been simple, frugal, sustained by the modest salary the church provided, and Samuel's absolute conviction that material possessions mattered far less than spiritual wealth. But challenging Sheriff Morrison's conclusions would have required resources Ruth did not have, influence she did not possess, and risks she could not afford to take with a young child and a baby on the way. So Samuel Washington became another name on a list that was far too long. Black men who had vanished in the South during the Civil Rights era, who had spoken too loudly about justice or organized too effectively for change, and who had simply disappeared one night as if the earth had opened and swallowed them whole. Their families learned to carry the weight of not knowing, learned to live with questions that had no safe answers, learned to find ways to honor the memory of men who had been erased as systematically as their names were removed from voter registration rolls. Ruth gave birth to Samuel Washington, Jr. on October 23, 1971, 2 months and 5 days after his father disappeared. The boy entered the world with his father's dark eyes and stubborn chin, and Ruth saw in her son's face both a blessing and a burden. The blessing of having a piece of Samuel that could never be taken from her, and the burden of raising a black son in Mississippi while carrying the knowledge that speaking truth in this place could cost everything. Mount Olive Baptist Church struggled to survive after Samuel's disappearance. Several families left, some moving north to cities like Detroit and Chicago, where relatives promised better jobs and safer lives. Others simply transferring to churches, where the pastor's fate served as a less constant reminder of their own vulnerability. The church building itself began to show signs of neglect, paint peeling from the wooden siding, weeds growing up through the gravel parking lot, windows that remained boarded up after being broken by rocks thrown in the night. For 3 years, the church was served by a series of interim ministers, older men who commuted from other towns and preached sermons that focused on personal salvation rather than social justice, on preparing for heaven rather than changing conditions on earth. These were good men, faithful men, but they understood the mathematics of survival in ways that Samuel Washington had either refused to acknowledge or chosen to ignore. In 1974, the church called a new permanent pastor, Reverend Marcus Clay, the grandson of the man who had mentored Samuel Washington in his calling to ministry. Marcus was 26 years old, careful where Samuel had been bold, diplomatic where Samuel had been prophetic. Under his leadership, Mount Olive Baptist stabilized, grew slowly, and found ways to serve its community without attracting the kind of attention that had cost Samuel Washington his life. Ruth Washington remained a member of Mount Olive Baptist, partly out of loyalty to Samuel's memory, and partly because the church represented the closest thing to family she had left in Meridian. She worked as a seamstress, taking in alterations and occasional wedding dress orders, supporting herself and her children through the kind of quiet determination that had sustained black women in the South for generations. She never remarried, though several good men expressed interest over the years. When asked why, she would say simply that her heart belonged to Samuel, and some loves were not meant to be replaced. Grace Washington grew up carrying her father's absence like a phantom limb, something that should have been there but wasn't, something that affected every movement even though it could not be seen. She was an excellent student, serious and studious, and she left Mississippi at 18 to attend Howard University, where she studied journalism with the vague hope that someday she might be able to find out what had really happened to her father. She never moved back to Mississippi, though she visited her mother and younger brother regularly, always staying in the same bedroom where she had hidden on the night her father disappeared. Samuel Jr., who insisted on being called Sam from the time he was old enough to state a preference, grew up with a father who existed only in stories, photographs, and the stubborn insistence of his mother and sister that Samuel Washington had been a good man who had died for trying to do right. Sam was athletic rather than scholarly, popular rather than serious, and he seemed to carry his father's absence more lightly than his sister did. He stayed in Mississippi, worked at the lumber mill where Deacon Hayes had worked decades earlier, married a local girl named Jennifer, and raised 3 children who knew their grandfather only as a name on a headstone in the Mount Olive Baptist Cemetery. For 40 years, Ruth Washington drove past the church every Sunday on her way to services, past the basement where Samuel had sometimes held Bible study groups on Wednesday evenings, when the sanctuary felt too formal for the kind of intimate discussions he preferred. The basement had been sealed off sometime in the mid-1970s, partly because of water damage from a particularly wet spring, and partly because the church could not afford the repairs necessary to make the space usable again. Over the decades, it became a storage area for old hymnals, broken furniture, and the accumulated detritus of a congregation that had survived long enough to accumulate history. Ruth often wondered what had become of her husband's body. In her darkest moments, usually late at night when sleep would not come, and the weight of 4 decades pressed down on her chest like a physical thing, she imagined Samuel buried in some unmarked grave in the Mississippi woods, his remains scattered by time and weather until nothing was left but bones that told no stories. In her better moments, she chose to believe that somehow, somewhere, Samuel Washington had found peace, had been reunited with the God he had served so faithfully, had discovered that love really was stronger than hate, even when hate appeared to win. By 2011, Mount Olive Baptist Church was celebrating its 90th anniversary, and the congregation had decided to renovate the entire building as part of their celebration. The sanctuary needed new carpet, the kitchen required updated appliances, and the basement, that forgotten space beneath the church, finally needed to be properly cleaned and restored. The renovation committee, led by Deacon Michael Turner, the grandson of the Robert Turner who had fled to Chicago the night before Samuel disappeared, decided that the basement could be converted into a modern fellowship hall, a place where the congregation could gather for meals and meetings, and the kind of community building that had always been central to the African American church experience. The excavation began on a Tuesday morning in September, 40 years and 1 month after Samuel Washington disappeared. The work crew, contracted from Jackson and unaware of the church's history, began the routine process of removing decades of stored items, clearing away damaged flooring, and preparing to dig out the foundation for a lower ceiling that would meet modern building codes. By Thursday afternoon, they had found something that transformed a simple renovation project into something else entirely. Something that would finally break the 40-year silence that had surrounded the disappearance of Reverend Samuel Washington. The call came to Ruth Washington at 3:47 p.m. on September 15, 2011, while she was hemming a pair of curtains for Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 streets over and had become one of Ruth's most reliable customers. Ruth was 78 years old now, her hair completely gray but her hands still steady enough for the intricate needlework that had supported her family for 4 decades. The phone rang with the kind of insistence that suggested urgency, and Ruth set down her sewing with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints no longer moved as smoothly as they once had. "Mrs. Washington?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, male, with the slightly formal tone of someone delivering official news. "This is Detective Raymond Phillips with the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation. Ma'am, I need to ask if you could come down to Mount Olive Baptist Church. We've found something during the renovation that requires your attention." Ruth Washington had been expecting this phone call for 40 years. Not consciously, perhaps, but in the way that people who have lived with unresolved trauma develop an instinct for the moment when the past finally catches up with the present. She had known, somewhere deep in the place where wives store their most private fears, that Samuel's body had never left Meridian. She had known that somewhere in this town where they had built a life together, where they had planned to raise their children and grow old together, Samuel Washington was waiting to be found. "I'll be right there," Ruth said quietly, and Detective Phillips could hear in her voice the weariness of a woman who had been carrying a terrible weight for far too long. The scene at Mount Olive Baptist Church looked like something from a movie about archaeology, rather than the routine renovation of a small rural congregation. Yellow police tape surrounded the entire building, and official vehicles from multiple law enforcement agencies crowded the parking lot where Samuel's congregants had once gathered for Sunday services. Detective Phillips met Ruth at the edge of the tape perimeter, a tall man in his 40s, with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone who had delivered too much bad news to too many families over the course of his career. "Mrs. Washington," he said gently, "I want to prepare you for what we've discovered. During the excavation of the basement, the work crew found what appear to be human remains. We're going to need dental records for identification, but—" He paused, clearly struggling with how to deliver information that was both devastating and, after 4 decades, somehow expected. "Ma'am, we also found some items that suggest this may be connected to your husband's disappearance." Ruth nodded, her face composed with the kind of dignity that had sustained her through 40 years of not knowing. "What kind of items?" Detective Phillips reached into an evidence bag and carefully removed a small object wrapped in plastic. Through the clear material, Ruth could see a wedding ring, the simple gold band that Samuel had worn since their wedding day in 1967. She had bought it at a pawn shop in Jackson, spending money she could barely afford on a symbol of commitment that had seemed more important than practical considerations, like food or rent. "There are other items," Detective Phillips continued softly. "A watch that matches the description you gave in your original statement, some clothing fragments, and—" He hesitated, clearly uncertain about how much detail to provide. "Mrs. Washington, we also found evidence that suggests your husband was not alone. There appear to be additional remains." Ruth felt her legs grow unsteady, and Detective Phillips immediately guided her to a folding chair that one of the other officers had brought from somewhere. Additional remains. The words echoed in her mind as she tried to process their implications. Had other people died the night Samuel disappeared? Had there been other families in Meridian carrying the same burden of not knowing, the same weight of questions without answers? "How many?" Ruth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're still excavating, but preliminary evidence suggests at least 2 additional individuals. Mrs. Washington, I know this is overwhelming, but we're going to need your help. We're going to need you to tell us everything you remember about the night your husband disappeared, and about the threats he had been receiving. This is no longer a missing person case. This is now a homicide investigation." Over the next 3 days, as the excavation continued, under the careful supervision of forensic anthropologists from the University of Mississippi, the full scope of what had been hidden beneath Mount Olive Baptist Church began to emerge. Samuel Washington's remains were found in what had once been a storage room in the basement, along with the remains of 2 other men who were eventually identified as Jerome Bailey, a 24-year-old civil rights worker who had disappeared from nearby Lauderdale County in 1969, and Robert Bobby Jefferson, a 31-year-old schoolteacher who had vanished from Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1968. Each man had been killed execution-style with a single gunshot to the back of the head. Each had been buried with their personal effects. Jerome Bailey, with the SNCC pin still attached to his shirt, Bobby Jefferson with a photograph of his 2 young daughters in his wallet. The killer or killers had made no attempt to hide the identities of their victims, suggesting either supreme confidence that the bodies would never be discovered, or a desire for the victims to be eventually identified as a warning to others who might consider following their example. The news of the discovery spread through Meridian's black community like wildfire, carried by phone calls, text messages, and the kind of informal communication networks that had sustained African American communities throughout the South for generations. People who had left Mississippi decades earlier called relatives still living in the area, asking for details about the excavation. Families who had lost fathers, brothers, and sons during the Civil Rights era began calling the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation, asking whether their loved ones might also be buried beneath the church that had been built as a sanctuary but had been used as a tomb. Grace Washington, now 54 and living in Washington, D.C., where she worked as a senior editor for the Washington Post, caught the first flight to Jackson when her mother called with the news. During the 2-hour drive from the airport to Meridian, Grace found herself remembering fragments of that terrible night 40 years earlier, the sound of car doors closing, the yellow glow of the porch light, the way her mother had held her so tightly in the back bedroom while they listened to their world ending. She had spent her entire adult life trying to understand what had happened to her father, had used her position as a journalist to investigate cold cases from the Civil Rights era, had written dozens of articles about the families left behind when good men disappeared into the Mississippi night. Now finally, there were answers. But answers, Grace was discovering, could be just as painful as questions. Sam Washington Jr., 40 years old and working as a shift supervisor at the lumber mill, took the day off work to join his mother and sister at the church. Sam had always claimed that his father's disappearance had not affected him as deeply as it had affected Grace. He had been only 2 months old when Samuel disappeared, too young to remember anything directly, too young to carry the trauma that comes from witnessing violence. But standing in the parking lot of Mount Olive Baptist Church, watching forensic investigators carefully excavate the basement where his father had been murdered and buried, Sam felt the full weight of a loss he had never allowed himself to fully acknowledge. Detective Phillips, who had handled dozens of cold cases during his 15-year career with the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation, was struck by the methodical nature of the crime scene. This was not the work of spontaneous violence or passion-driven murder. Someone had planned this carefully, had chosen the location with deliberate precision, had arranged for the bodies to be buried in a place where they might remain hidden indefinitely. The basement of Mount Olive Baptist Church had been an ideal location for a mass grave. Sacred ground that would not be disturbed lightly, a foundation that would not be excavated without careful consideration, a place where the victim's own community would unknowingly gather for worship above the bones of martyrs. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the physical evidence found at the church. FBI agents specializing in civil rights cold cases arrived from the Jackson field office, bringing with them files that had been sealed for decades, documents that detailed the systematic campaign of terror that had been waged against black communities throughout Mississippi during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The names that emerged from these files read like a roll call of hatred: white citizens, councils, local chapters of the Ku Klux Klan, and informal networks of white supremacists who had coordinated their efforts to silence anyone who spoke out against the racial status quo. One name appeared repeatedly in the files: Thomas "Tommy" Morrison, the nephew of Sheriff Buck Morrison and a known member of the local Ku Klux Klan chapter. Tommy Morrison had been questioned in connection with several racially motivated crimes during the 1970s, but had never been charged, protected by family connections and the general reluctance of local law enforcement to investigate crimes against black citizens too aggressively. FBI files indicated that Morrison had been the subject of ongoing surveillance during the early 1970s, but that surveillance had been discontinued in 1975, when budget constraints forced the Bureau to redirect resources to other priorities. Tommy Morrison was still alive in 2011, 73 years old, and living in a nursing home in Hattiesburg, suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease that had gradually erased his memory over the previous 5 years. Detective Phillips and FBI agent Sarah Chen visited Morrison at the Magnolia Manor Care Facility on September 22, 7 days after the discovery of the bodies, hoping to obtain some kind of confession or at least additional information about the murders. Morrison, thin and frail in a way that made it difficult to imagine him as the vital, dangerous man he had once been, showed no recognition when the investigators mentioned Samuel Washington's name. He stared at them with the blank expression of someone whose mind had retreated to a place beyond the reach of questions about the past. When Agent Chin showed him a photograph of Mount Olive Baptist Church, Morrison began crying, not the tears of guilt or remorse, but the confused weeping of someone whose emotional responses had become disconnected from their causes. "He's gone," the nursing home administrator told the investigators after they had spent an hour attempting to interview Morrison. "Whatever he did, whatever he knew, it's locked away in a mind that doesn't work anymore. It's like trying to get information from a ghost." The investigation turned instead to documentary evidence, to the careful reconstruction of events through official records, witness statements, and the physical evidence found at the church. Ballistics tests revealed that all 3 men had been killed with the same weapon, a .38 caliber revolver that had never been recovered. Forensic analysis of the burial site suggested that the murders had taken place sometime between late August and early October 1971, with Samuel Washington's death occurring approximately 2 weeks after Jerome Bailey's and 1 month after Bobby Jefferson's. This timeline painted a horrifying picture of systematic elimination. Bobby Jefferson, schoolteacher from Philadelphia, Mississippi, had been active in voter registration efforts. Jerome Bailey, the SNCC worker from Lauderdale County, had been organizing boycotts of businesses that refused to hire black employees. Samuel Washington had been preaching about justice and equality while building a congregation that was becoming increasingly engaged in civil rights activities. Each man had been perceived as a threat to the racial order that white supremacist groups were determined to maintain, and each had been eliminated with the cold efficiency of people who saw murder as a form of public service. The physical evidence also revealed something else that made the crimes even more chilling in their calculation. The basement of Mount Olive Baptist Church had been modified specifically to serve as a burial site. Someone had dug out a section of the floor, had lined the excavation with lime to accelerate decomposition, had arranged for the bodies to be buried in a way that would minimize the chance of accidental discovery. This was not the work of opportunistic killers looking for a convenient place to hide evidence. This was the work of people who had planned multiple murders and had chosen a location that would serve as both practical convenience and symbolic statement. The symbolism was unmistakable and deliberate. By burying civil rights workers beneath a black church, the killers had transformed sacred ground into a monument to white supremacy. They had forced Mount Olive Baptist Church to unknowingly serve as a mausoleum for martyrs, had compelled Samuel Washington's own congregation to worship above the grave of their murdered pastor. It was an act of violence that extended far beyond the taking of individual lives. It was an assault on the very concept of sanctuary, a desecration of the idea that there could be safe spaces in a world defined by racial hatred. Ruth Washington, sitting in the front pew of Mount Olive Baptist Church during the first Sunday service after the discovery of the bodies, understood all of this with the clarity that comes from having lived through 40 years of questions that finally had answers. The church had been reconsecrated by Bishop William Turner, who had driven down from Jackson specifically for the purpose of ritually cleansing the space that had been violated by murder and concealment. The basement had been sealed permanently, and a memorial garden would be planted above the site where Samuel, Jerome, and Bobby had been found. But Ruth Washington knew that no amount of ritual cleansing could completely restore what had been taken from this place, from this community, from her family. Evil had been done here, had been hidden here, had been allowed to fester in darkness for 40 years, while good people unknowingly walked above the graves of men who had died for believing that love was stronger than hate, that justice was worth the risk of everything, that speaking truth was more important than staying safe. The excavation was complete, but the real work, the work of understanding, of healing, of ensuring that the deaths of Samuel Washington, Jerome Bailey, and Bobby Jefferson would serve as something more than just another tragedy in the long history of racial violence in America. That work was just beginning. The funeral service for Reverend Samuel Washington took place on October 15, 2011, exactly 40 years and 2 months after he disappeared into the Mississippi night. Mount Olive Baptist Church was filled beyond capacity, with mourners standing along the walls and spilling out into the parking lot where speakers had been hastily set up to accommodate the overflow crowd. People had traveled from across the country to pay their respects. Former congregants who had fled Mississippi decades earlier, civil rights veterans who had known Samuel during his brief but impactful ministry, journalists and activists who understood that this funeral represented more than just the burial of one man's remains. Ruth Washington, now 78 years old, and wearing the same black dress she had worn to countless funerals over the past 4 decades, sat in the front pew, flanked by her children and grandchildren. Grace, who had taken a leave of absence from the Washington Post to help coordinate the media coverage of the case, held her mother's hand with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had spent a lifetime trying to shield her family from additional pain. Sam Jr., uncomfortable in the suit he had purchased specifically for the occasion, kept looking around the packed church with amazement, as if seeing for the first time the full scope of his father's legacy. The service was conducted by Bishop William Turner, a man who had known Samuel during their seminary days and who had the kind of powerful preaching voice that seemed to lift the very rafters of the old church. Bishop Turner spoke about martyrdom without seeking it, about courage that costs everything, about the kind of faith that continues to bear fruit long after the person who planted the seeds has returned to the earth. Samuel Washington did not choose to die, Bishop Turner said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed sanctuary. But he chose to live in a way that made his death inevitable. He chose to love in a place where love was dangerous. He chose to speak truth in a community where truth was unwelcome. He chose to stand for justice in a time and place where justice was considered a threat to the natural order of things. The bishop paused, allowing his words to settle over the congregation like a benediction. And because Samuel Washington made those choices, because Jerome Bailey and Bobby Jefferson made those choices, we are gathered here today in a world that is different from the one they left behind. Not perfect, not healed, but different. Better, more just, more loving, more hopeful. Among the mourners were 3 elderly white men who had driven over from Lauderdale County specifically to attend Samuel's funeral. They sat together in the back of the church, clearly uncomfortable but determined to bear witness to something that had taken them 40 years to acknowledge. After the service, as people gathered in the church parking lot for the graveside ceremony, one of the men approached Ruth Washington with the careful steps of someone walking across broken glass. "Mrs. Washington," he said quietly, removing his hat as he spoke, "my name is James Carroll. I knew your husband. I was one of the people who threatened him back in 1971. Ruth Washington looked at this elderly white man, thin, frail, with eyes that carried the weight of 4 decades of regret, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but something adjacent to it. A recognition that the capacity for evil and the capacity for redemption often existed within the same human heart. "I can't undo what we did," James Carroll continued, his voice barely audible above the conversations taking place around them. "I can't bring your husband back, can't give you those 40 years of marriage and family that were stolen from you. But I wanted you to know that not a day has passed since 1971 that I haven't thought about Samuel Washington, haven't wished I had been a different kind of man." Ruth studied his face for a long moment, this stranger who had been part of the nightmare that had shaped her entire adult life. "Mr. Carroll," she said finally, "what exactly are you asking of me?" James Carroll's hands shook as he struggled to find words for something that might be beyond language. I suppose I'm asking if there's any possibility that God might forgive what we did. If there's any chance that your husband might forgive what we did. If there's any hope for people like me who spent so many years on the wrong side of everything that matters." Ruth Washington was quiet for a long moment, aware that her response to this question would be heard not just by James Carroll, but by her children, her grandchildren, and the broader community that was watching this conversation with intense interest. Finally, she placed her hand on the old man's arm, a gesture that surprised both of them with its gentleness. "Mr. Carroll," she said, "my husband used to say that the gospel is not about good people and bad people. It's about lost people and found people. If you've been lost for 40 years, and you're ready to be found, then maybe that's where healing begins." The formal investigation into the murders of Samuel Washington, Jerome Bailey, and Bobby Jefferson continued for another 8 months, but the results were ultimately frustrating for everyone seeking justice. Tommy Morrison, the prime suspect based on FBI files and witness testimony, remained locked in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease, unable to stand trial or provide any information about his alleged crimes. 2 other suspects identified by the investigation had died in the 1990s, taking their secrets to graves that would never be excavated. The case was officially closed in June 2012, with the notation that while the murders had been solved in terms of identifying the victims and understanding the circumstances of their deaths, no criminal prosecutions would be possible due to the death or incapacitation of the suspected perpetrators. For some people, this outcome felt like justice denied. For others, including Ruth Washington, it represented a form of closure that had less to do with punishment and more to do with truth-telling. The discovery of the bodies beneath Mount Olive Baptist Church had national implications that extended far beyond the specific case of 3 murdered civil rights workers. The FBI reopened dozens of cold cases from the civil rights era, using new forensic techniques and previously classified documents to investigate crimes that had been ignored or inadequately pursued when they originally occurred. Universities began offering courses on the history of racial violence in America, using the Mount Olive case as a study in how systematic terrorism had been used to maintain white supremacy throughout the South. More importantly, the case sparked conversations in communities across Mississippi and throughout the South about the ongoing legacy of racial violence, about the ways that historical trauma continues to shape contemporary life, about the responsibility that current generations bear for acknowledging and addressing the crimes of the past. Churches, schools, and community organizations organized forums where people could speak openly about experiences that had been suppressed for decades, where families could share stories about loved ones who had disappeared or been murdered, where communities could begin the difficult work of reckoning with their own histories. Mount Olive Baptist Church became a pilgrimage site of sorts, drawing visitors from around the world who wanted to see the place where Samuel Washington had preached his final sermon, where 3 men had been murdered for believing in justice, where a community had worshipped unknowingly above the graves of martyrs for 40 years. The church established a small museum in the renovated basement, displaying photographs and documents related to the civil rights movement in Mississippi, along with personal items belonging to Samuel, Jerome, and Bobby that had been found during the excavation. Ruth Washington, who had spent 40 years carrying the weight of not knowing what had happened to her husband, found herself transformed by the discovery from a victim into something more complex. A witness, a keeper of memory, a symbol of resilience. She began speaking at churches, schools, and community centers about her experience, about the importance of remembering history honestly, about the ways that love can persist even in the face of hatred that seems overwhelming. People ask me if I'm angry. Ruth would tell these audiences, her voice still strong despite her advancing years. They ask me if I hate the men who killed my husband, if I want revenge, if I feel bitter about all those years of not knowing. And the truth is, I've felt all of those things at different times. But what I've learned is that anger and hatred are too heavy to carry for 40 years. They'll kill you just as surely as a bullet will, just more slowly. She would pause at this point in her speech, allowing her words to settle over the audience like a gentle rain. My husband used to say that the opposite of love isn't hate. It's indifference. Hatred, at least, acknowledges that the other person matters enough to provoke strong feelings. Indifference treats people as if they don't exist at all. The men who killed Samuel, Jerome, and Bobby, they wanted the world to be indifferent to their deaths, to forget that they had ever lived, to pretend that their murders had never happened. Ruth Washington would look directly at her audience at this point, making eye contact with individuals scattered throughout the room. But we remember. We tell their stories. We refuse to let their deaths be meaningless. And in remembering and refusing to be indifferent, we transform what was meant to be an ending into a beginning. The memorial garden planted above the site where the 3 men were found became a place of pilgrimage and reflection, with visitors leaving flowers, notes, and small stones in the Jewish tradition of marking graves. The garden featured 3 trees, a oak for Samuel Washington, a maple for Jerome Bailey, and a pine for Bobby Jefferson, surrounded by flowers that bloomed in different seasons, ensuring that there was always something beautiful growing above the place where violence had tried to plant only death. Grace Washington, working with documentary filmmakers and historians, began collecting oral histories from people who had lived through the civil rights era in Mississippi. creating an archive that would preserve the voices and experiences of a generation that was rapidly passing away. Sam Washington Jr. started a scholarship fund in his father's name, providing financial assistance to young people from Meridian who wanted to attend college and study social justice, education, or ministry. By 2015, 4 years after the discovery of the bodies, Mount Olive Baptist Church had become something unprecedented in its 94-year history, a thriving congregation that attracted members from across racial and economic lines, a place where the tragedy of the past had somehow become the foundation for a more hopeful future. The church's current pastor, Reverend Maria Santos, a young Latina woman who had grown up in Jackson and studied at Yale Divinity School, preached sermons that explicitly connected the struggle for civil rights in the 1960s and 70s with contemporary movements for social justice. Samuel Washington's voice was silenced by violence, Reverend Santos would say, from the same pulpit where Samuel had delivered his final sermon, but his message continues to speak. Jerome Bailey and Bobby Jefferson were murdered for believing that all people deserve dignity and justice, but their belief has outlived their killers. The men who tried to bury truth beneath this church discovered something that every generation must learn. You cannot kill an idea whose time has come. You cannot murder hope. You cannot bury love so deep that it will not eventually rise again. The congregation would respond with, "Amen," and "Tell it," and "Preach it, sister." The call and response tradition that had sustained black churches through slavery, segregation, and all the long centuries of struggle. But now these responses came from voices that were black and white, young and old, native-born and immigrant, creating a kind of harmony that Samuel Washington had dreamed of but had never lived to hear. Ruth Washington, approaching 80 years old and still living in the same house behind the church where she had raised her children, often sat in her kitchen on quiet evenings and listened to the sounds of choir practice drifting across the parking lot. The voices reminded her of something Samuel had told her during their early days in Meridian, when the threats were just beginning and the future felt uncertain. "Ruth, I believe that love is the only force in the universe strong enough to transform hatred. I believe that truth is the only power capable of defeating lies. I believe that justice is the only foundation sturdy enough to support a world where all of God's children can live in peace." Samuel Washington had been dead for 40 years when his body was finally laid to rest beside the church where he had preached about love conquering hate. But his words, Ruth realized, had never died at all. They had simply been waiting, buried but not destroyed, for the right moment to rise again and find new voices to carry them forward into an uncertain but more hopeful future. In the spring of 2016, 5 years after the discovery of the bodies beneath Mount Olive Baptist Church, a delegation of college students from Howard University traveled to Meridian as part of their civil rights history course. Among them was Marcus Washington, Samuel and Ruth's great-grandson, a 20-year-old journalism major who carried his great-grandfather's middle name and his passion for justice, though he had grown up in suburban Atlanta, far removed from the Mississippi soil where his family's roots ran deep, with both blessing and trauma. Marcus had learned about his great-grandfather's story in fragments throughout his childhood. Careful conversations between his grandmother Grace and his parents, whispered references to family tragedy that had shaped multiple generations, old photographs that showed a young minister with kind eyes and strong hands who had disappeared before Marcus's grandfather Sam Jr. was old enough to remember him. But it wasn't until Marcus was 16 years old and wrote a high school research paper about civil rights martyrs that he truly understood the full scope of what Samuel Washington had represented, and what his death had cost not just their family, but the broader movement for justice in America. Standing in the sanctuary of Mount Olive Baptist Church, Marcus felt the weight of inherited legacy settling on his shoulders, like a mantle he had not asked for but could not refuse. The church was smaller than he had expected, just 40 pews arranged in 2 sections, with simple wooden walls and those famous stained glass windows that had been described in every article about his great-grandfather's disappearance. But there was something about the space that felt larger than its physical dimensions, as if the walls themselves had absorbed decades of prayers and sorrows and hopes, creating a kind of spiritual echo chamber where the past continued to speak to anyone willing to listen. Ruth Washington, now 83 years old but still mentally sharp, served as the students' guide, walking slowly but steadily through the church and sharing stories that textbooks could never capture. She pointed to the 3rd pew on the left, where Samuel used to sit with his family when other ministers were preaching. She showed them the small office behind the sanctuary where Samuel had prepared his sermons, still containing the desk where he had been writing about courage and faith on the night he disappeared. She led them to the memorial garden, where 3 trees now stood 30 feet tall, their roots extending deep into soil that had once hidden the evidence of hatred, but now nourished symbols of remembrance and hope. "Your great-grandfather," Ruth said to Marcus as the group stood beneath the oak tree planted in Samuel's memory, "used to say that a person's life isn't measured by how many years they live, but by how many lives they touch. He was only 34 when he died, but his influence has been growing for 45 years now, reaching people he never met, inspiring changes he never saw, creating ripples that are still spreading outward." Marcus nodded, understanding intellectually what his great-grandmother was telling him, but struggling to reconcile the ordinariness of this place with the magnitude of the tragedy that had occurred here. How could somewhere so peaceful, so quiet, have been the site of such violence? How could a community that now seemed so welcoming have once harbored the kind of hatred that murdered ministers for preaching love? The answer came during a conversation with James Carroll, the elderly white man who had confessed his role in threatening Samuel Washington, and who now, at 81 years old, had become an unlikely advocate for racial reconciliation. Carroll had asked to meet with the Howard University students, and Ruth Washington had agreed, believing that hearing from someone who had been on the wrong side of history might provide valuable lessons for young people who would inherit responsibility for creating a more just future. Carroll, thin and frail but determined to bear witness to his own transformation, sat in the same sanctuary where Samuel had preached his final sermon, and spoke with painful honesty about the psychology of hatred, about how good people could be convinced to participate in evil, about the long road from perpetrating violence to seeking forgiveness. "I was 28 years old when your great-grandfather came to Meridian," Carroll told Marcus, his voice wavering but clear. "I was married, had 2 young children, worked at the lumber mill, went to church every Sunday. I thought of myself as a decent person, a Christian man. But I had been raised to believe that God intended for the races to remain separate, that integration was a threat to the natural order, that black people who pushed for equal rights were troublemakers who deserved whatever happened to them." Carroll paused, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief that had seen similar use many times over the past 5 years. "It's easy to hate people when you don't really see them as people. It's easy to justify violence when you've convinced yourself that your victims aren't fully human. But Samuel Washington, when I heard him preach, when I saw the way he loved his family, when I witnessed his courage in the face of threats that would have sent most men running, I couldn't maintain the lie that he was somehow less than me, less deserving of life and dignity and respect." Marcus leaned forward in his pew, fascinated despite himself by this window into the mind of someone who had threatened his great-grandfather. "But you still participated in the threats. You still helped create the climate that led to his murder." "Yes," Carroll said simply, "I did. And I've spent the last 40 years trying to understand how that was possible, trying to figure out how someone who thought of himself as good could do something so evil. The answer, I think, is that evil rarely announces itself as evil. It usually comes disguised as tradition, or community loyalty, or protecting your family, or defending your way of life. It convinces you that you're the victim, that you're the one under attack, that violence is really just self-defense." The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering topics that most people preferred to avoid: the persistence of racism in contemporary America, the ways that historical trauma continues to affect communities decades after the initial violence, the difficulty of true reconciliation between people whose ancestors had harmed and been harmed by each other. But what struck Marcus most powerfully was not the content of the conversation, but its very existence. Here, in this church where his great-grandfather had been murdered, a former perpetrator and the victim's family were sitting together, speaking honestly about the past, working together toward a future that honored both truth and healing. During the bus ride back to Jackson, where the students would catch their flight to Washington, D.C., Marcus found himself thinking about legacy, not just his great-grandfather's legacy, but his own responsibility as someone who carried Samuel Washington's DNA and his commitment to justice. What did it mean to be the descendant of a martyr? What obligations came with bearing the name of someone who had died for his beliefs? How could a 20-year-old college student from suburban Atlanta possibly live up to the example set by a man who had been willing to sacrifice everything for the cause of equality? The answers began to emerge over the following months as Marcus threw himself into journalism with renewed intensity, understanding for the first time that his career choice was not just about personal interest, but about continuing his great-grandfather's work of speaking truth in the face of power. He wrote articles about voter suppression in contemporary Georgia, about the ways that economic inequality perpetuated racial disparities, about the connections between historical trauma and current social problems. Each article was a small act of bearing witness, a way of honoring Samuel Washington's memory by refusing to be silent about injustice. Grace Washington, now 59 years old and serving as a senior correspondent covering national politics, watched her grandson's development as a journalist with a mixture of pride and concern. She recognized in Marcus the same passion for truth-telling that had driven her father to speak out against inequality, the same inability to remain quiet when confronted with injustice. But she also understood the cost that came with such commitment, the ways that speaking truth could isolate you from people who preferred comfortable lies, the personal sacrifices required by a life dedicated to social change. "Marcus," she said during one of their regular phone conversations, "I want you to remember that your great-grandfather wasn't trying to be a martyr. He was trying to be faithful. He was trying to live according to his beliefs, trying to serve his community, trying to raise his children in a world that was a little bit more just than the one he had inherited. The martyrdom was something that was done to him, not something he chose." The distinction mattered because it suggested that the goal was not to seek suffering for its own sake, but to live with enough integrity and courage that you would accept suffering if it came as the price of remaining true to your values. Samuel Washington had not wanted to die. He had wanted to live in a way that made life meaningful for himself and his community. The fact that such living had cost him his life was a tragedy, but it was also a testament to the power of love to inspire actions that transcended individual self-interest. By 2018, the 7th anniversary of the discovery of the bodies, Mount Olive Baptist Church had become something unprecedented in its nearly century-long history, a genuinely integrated congregation that attracted members from across the racial, economic, and political spectrum in Meridian. The church's membership had grown to over 300 people, requiring the construction of a new fellowship hall, built above ground this time, and the addition of 2 Sunday services to accommodate everyone who wanted to worship there. The transformation had not been without challenges. Some longtime members had left, uncomfortable with changes that brought in people who looked different, spoke different languages, or approached faith from unfamiliar theological perspectives. Some newcomers had struggled to understand traditions and customs that had sustained the African American religious experience through centuries of oppression and survival. But under the leadership of Reverend Maria Santos, the congregation had found ways to honor its history while embracing a future that Samuel Washington had dreamed of but never lived to see. The church's annual Samuel Washington Memorial Service, held every August 18th to commemorate the anniversary of his disappearance, had become one of the largest interfaith gatherings in Mississippi. The 2018 service drew nearly 2,000 people, including civil rights veterans, religious leaders from multiple denominations, politicians, journalists, and ordinary citizens, who understood that remembering Samuel Washington meant committing to continue the work he had died for. Ruth Washington, now 85 years old and using a walker to navigate the uneven ground of the Memorial Garden, served as the keynote speaker for that year's service. Standing beneath the oak tree that marked her husband's final resting place, she spoke to the crowd about the difference between memory and nostalgia, between honoring the past and romanticizing it, between learning from history and being trapped by it. "Samuel didn't die so that we could build monuments to him," Ruth said, her voice still strong despite her advancing age. "He died because he believed that love is stronger than hate, that truth is more powerful than lies, that justice is worth any sacrifice." The question for us is not whether we remember Samuel Washington, but whether we're willing to live the kind of lives that make his death meaningful. She paused, looking out over the diverse crowd that had gathered to honor her husband's memory. Black and white faces, young and old, locals and visitors, Christians and Jews and Muslims and people of no particular faith who had come simply because they believed in the human dignity that Samuel Washington had died defending. 7 years ago, when we found Samuel's body beneath this church, people asked me if I felt closure, if I could finally move on, if the questions that had haunted our family for 40 years were finally answered. And the truth is, some questions were answered. We learned what happened to Samuel, Jerome, and Bobby. We learned who killed them and why. We learned that our suspicions about law enforcement indifference were correct, that our fear of ongoing danger had been justified. Ruth's voice grew stronger as she continued, as if drawing energy from the crowd's attention and the importance of her message. But the discovery also created new questions, more important questions. It forced us to ask not just what happened 47 years ago, but what's happening now. Not just who was responsible for those murders, but who's responsible for creating the kind of community where such love and such hatred can exist side by side. Not just how we remember the past, but how we shape the future. The crowd was completely quiet now, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something historic. The widow of a civil rights martyr speaking truth to a new generation about the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. Samuel used to say that the kingdom of God is not a place we go when we die, but a way of living here and now that makes earth a little bit more like heaven. Looking at all of you gathered here today, people of different races and religions and backgrounds united in commitment to the values that Samuel died for, I think maybe we're getting a glimpse of what that kingdom looks like. Ruth Washington stepped back from the microphone to thunderous applause, but what moved her most was not the sound of clapping hands, but the sight of people who had been strangers to each other, embracing, exchanging contact information, making plans to continue working together long after the memorial service had ended. This, she realized, was what resurrection looked like. Not the return of the dead, but the transformation of the living, the way that love planted in sorrow could grow into something beautiful enough to change the world. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus Washington approached his great-grandmother and took her arm gently, helping her navigate the uneven ground as they walked back toward the church. "Great-Grandma Ruth," he said quietly, "do you think Great-Grandpa Samuel would be proud of what's happened here? Do you think he would feel like his sacrifice was worth it?" Ruth Washington was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Finally, she smiled, the same gentle, knowing smile that had sustained her through 47 years of widowhood, grief, questions, and ultimately a kind of peace that transcended understanding. "Marcus," she said, "your great-grandfather always used to say that we plant trees, not for ourselves, but for our grandchildren. I think Samuel would look at this church, at this community, at young people like you who are committed to carrying on the work of justice and reconciliation, and he would understand that the seeds he planted with his life and his death are finally bearing the kind of fruit he always believed was possible." They walked together toward the church building, great-grandmother and great-grandson, linked not just by blood, but by shared commitment to the values that had cost Samuel Washington his life and had sustained his family through nearly 5 decades of learning how to transform tragedy into hope, loss into legacy, death into resurrection. Ruth Washington died peacefully in her sleep on March 15, 2019, 3 weeks before her 86th birthday, in the same bedroom where she had hidden with 4-year-old Grace on the night Samuel disappeared 48 years earlier. She was found the next morning by her neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy Jenkins, who had come to check on Ruth when she failed to appear for their daily walk through the memorial garden, a ritual they had maintained for the past 3 years. 2 elderly black women moving slowly among the flowers and trees that marked the place where violence had tried to plant only death, but had instead nurtured a garden of remembrance. The funeral service for Ruth Washington filled Mount Olive Baptist Church to capacity once again, but this time the gathering carried a different emotional weight than Samuel's service 8 years earlier. Where Samuel's funeral had been about justice delayed and truth finally revealed, Ruth's funeral was about a life fully lived, a mission completed, a torch successfully passed to the next generation. She had survived 48 years of widowhood, had raised 2 children as a single mother in the segregated South, had lived to see her husband's murderers identified and her community transformed, had witnessed the election of America's first black president and the establishment of her husband's church as a beacon of racial reconciliation. Grace Washington, now 62 years old and recently retired from her position at the Washington Post, delivered the eulogy for her mother with the same grace and dignity that had characterized Ruth's approach to life. Standing at the same podium where her father had preached his final sermon, Grace spoke about resilience and faith, about the ways that love can outlast hatred, about the mysterious process by which personal tragedy can become a source of healing for entire communities. "My mother," Grace said, looking out over the packed sanctuary, "spent nearly half a century proving that the strongest force in the universe is not violence, but love. Not hatred, but hope. Not the power to destroy, but the power to forgive." She could have spent those 48 years consumed by bitterness about what was taken from her. Instead, she chose to focus on what remained: her children, her community, her faith, and her unwavering belief that my father's death would ultimately serve a purpose larger than any of us could understand at the time. The congregation included people who had known Ruth for decades, and others who had met her only in recent years, drawn to Mount Olive Baptist Church by the story of Samuel Washington and the example of the widow who had transformed personal loss into community healing. There were civil rights veterans who had worked alongside Samuel in the 1960s and 70s, journalists who had covered the discovery of the bodies, politicians who had been influenced by Ruth's advocacy for civil rights, cold case investigations, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by her quiet example of dignity in the face of unimaginable loss. Marcus Washington, now 23 years old and working as a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, spoke about his great-grandmother's influence on his own development as both a person and a professional. Great-grandma Ruth taught me that journalism is not just about reporting facts, he said, but about bearing witness to truth, especially when that truth is uncomfortable or inconvenient. She taught me that our responsibility as writers is not just to inform people about what happened, but to help them understand why it matters, how it connects to their own lives, what it demands of them in terms of action and commitment. Marcus had spent the past 3 years investigating other civil rights cold cases throughout the South. Using the skills he had learned in journalism school and the passion for justice he had inherited from his family's history. His work had led to the reopening of 17 cases, the identification of remains in 3 instances, and the prosecution of 2 elderly defendants who had escaped justice for decades. He understood his career not just as professional advancement, but as a continuation of the work that Samuel Washington had died for, a way of ensuring that the sacrifice made in 1971 would continue to generate positive change in the 21st century. After Ruth's burial in the Mount Olive Baptist Church Cemetery, beside the grave of her husband that had remained empty for 40 years until his remains were finally discovered, the congregation gathered in the new fellowship hall for a meal and a time of sharing memories. The stories that emerged painted a picture of a woman who had channeled grief into service, who had transformed personal loss into community building, who had proven that love really could be stronger than hate if it was willing to endure long enough and work hard enough. Mrs. Ethel Mae Johnson, now 97 years old and the church's oldest living member, spoke about Ruth's evolution from the terrified young widow of 1971 to the confident community leader of recent years. Ruth Washington, Mrs. Johnson said, taught all of us that survival is not just about staying alive, but about staying human. She showed us that you can lose everything that matters to you and still find ways to make your life matter to other people. James Carroll, the former Klansman who had become an unlikely symbol of racial reconciliation, struggled to his feet despite his 83 years, and spoke with trembling voice about Ruth's willingness to forgive, to listen, to see the possibility for redemption, even in people who had participated in her family's tragedy. Mrs. Washington saved my soul, Carroll said simply. She could have responded to my confession with hatred, with rejection, with the kind of anger that would have been completely justified. Instead, she responded with grace that I didn't deserve and didn't understand. She taught me that forgiveness is not about forgetting the past, but about refusing to let the past poison the future. Reverend Maria Santos, who had served as Mount Olive Baptist Church's pastor for the past 6 years, spoke about Ruth's influence on the congregation's transformation from a traditional African-American church to an integrated community of faith that drew members from across racial and ethnic lines. Ruth Washington understood something that took the rest of us years to learn, Reverend Santos said. She understood that honoring the memory of martyrs doesn't mean building walls around their legacy. It means opening doors, building bridges, creating space for other people to join the work that the martyrs died for. The conversation continued late into the evening, with people sharing stories that revealed the full scope of Ruth Washington's influence on her community. She had mentored young mothers struggling to raise children alone, had advocated for better schools in predominantly black neighborhoods, had worked with law enforcement to improve relations between police and the communities they served, had served on committees that brought together religious leaders from different denominations to address common concerns about poverty, education, and social justice. But perhaps her most important legacy was less tangible than any specific program or initiative. Ruth Washington had demonstrated for nearly 5 decades that it was possible to respond to hatred with love, to answer violence with peace, to transform personal tragedy into community healing. She had proven that forgiveness was not weakness but strength, that reconciliation was not surrender but victory, that hope was not naivete but the most realistic response to a world that often seemed determined to choose despair. In the months following Ruth's death, Mount Olive Baptist Church established the Ruth Washington Center for Racial Reconciliation, a program that brought together people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds for honest conversations about the legacy of historical trauma and the possibilities for contemporary healing. The center offered workshops on conflict resolution, provided resources for communities dealing with racial tensions, and served as a model for other religious institutions seeking to address the ongoing impact of America's history of racial violence. The center's first major initiative was a partnership with the University of Southern Mississippi to create an oral history project documenting the experiences of families affected by civil rights-era violence. The project, directed by Marcus Washington and funded by grants from several national foundations, collected interviews with survivors, witnesses, and even some perpetrators of racial violence, creating an archive that would be available to researchers, educators, and community leaders working to understand and address the ongoing legacy of historical trauma. One of the most powerful interviews in the collection was conducted with Grace Washington, who spoke with remarkable candor about the long-term impact of losing her father at age 4. "People often ask me if I remember my father," Grace said during the recorded interview. "The truth is, I don't remember him in the way that people usually mean. I don't have clear memories of conversations or specific moments we shared. But I remember something deeper than that. I remember feeling completely safe and loved whenever he was near. I remember the sound of his laughter. I remember the way he would pick me up and swing me around until I was dizzy with joy." Grace paused, collecting her thoughts before continuing. "When my father was murdered, I lost more than just a parent. I lost the sense that the world was a safe place, that good people would be protected, that speaking truth would lead to justice rather than violence. It took me decades to understand that losing those illusions wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It forced me to develop a more mature faith, one that was based on hope rather than naivete, on commitment rather than comfort." The Oral History Project expanded over the following years to include families from across the South who had been affected by racial violence, creating a comprehensive archive that documented not just the immediate impact of such violence, but its generational effects on communities and individuals. The stories that emerged painted a complex picture of trauma and resilience, of communities that had been damaged by hatred, but had found ways to heal and grow stronger. By 2022, 11 years after the discovery of Samuel Washington's remains, Mount Olive Baptist Church had become something unprecedented in its 101-year history, a genuine beacon of hope in a region that had long been associated with racial conflict and violence. The church's membership included people from 14 different countries, representing African American, white, Latino, Asian, and Middle Eastern communities, all united by shared commitment to the values that Samuel Washington had died defending. The annual Samuel Washington Memorial Service had evolved into a week-long festival of racial reconciliation, drawing visitors from around the world who wanted to learn from a community that had transformed tragedy into triumph, hatred into healing, death into resurrection. The 2022 festival included workshops on conflict resolution, panels on the history of civil rights in Mississippi, concerts featuring music from different cultural traditions, and interfaith services that demonstrated the possibility of unity without uniformity. Marcus Washington, now 26 years old and serving as the executive director of the Ruth Washington Center for Racial Reconciliation, had become a nationally recognized expert on civil rights cold cases and community healing. His work had expanded beyond Mississippi to include cases throughout the South, and his book, The Long Arc of Justice: How Communities Heal from Historical Trauma, had become required reading in universities and seminaries across the country. But Marcus understood that his most important work was not the cases he solved, or the articles he wrote, or the speeches he delivered. His most important work was the daily effort to live in a way that honored the sacrifice of his great-grandfather while building bridges to a future that Samuel Washington had dreamed of, but never lived to see. Standing in the Memorial Garden on a quiet Tuesday evening in September 2022, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought his family and his community from the darkness of August 18, 1971, to the light of a new century that seemed to offer hope for genuine racial reconciliation. The 3 trees planted in memory of Samuel Washington, Jerome Bailey, and Bobby Jefferson had grown tall and strong, their branches intertwining to create a canopy of shade where people from all backgrounds came to reflect, pray, and commit themselves to the ongoing work of justice. The evening air carried the sound of choir practice from the church sanctuary, where voices of different ages and ethnicities blended in harmonies that would have amazed Samuel Washington, not because he would have been surprised by their beauty, but because he would have recognized in their diversity the fulfillment of dreams he had been willing to die for. Marcus pulled out his phone and called his sister, Sarah, who was finishing her residency in pediatrics at Emory University in Atlanta and planning to return to Mississippi to establish a community health clinic that would serve families regardless of their ability to pay. They talked for 20 minutes about their work, their plans, their shared commitment to continuing the legacy of great-grandparents they had never met, but whose influence had shaped every aspect of their lives. As the conversation ended and Marcus prepared to walk home through the streets of Meridian, he thought about legacy not as something that belonged to the past, but as something that lived in the present and pointed toward the future. Samuel Washington had been dead for 51 years, but his influence was still growing, still reaching people he had never met, still inspiring changes he had never imagined. The story of Samuel Washington, Jerome Bailey, and Bobby Jefferson was not really a story about death, Marcus realized. It was a story about life, about the way that lives lived with integrity and courage continued to generate positive change long after those lives have ended, about the way that love planted in sacrifice can grow into something beautiful enough to transform entire communities, about the way that truth buried in darkness will eventually find its way to light. If stories like Sarah's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.